The two issues I deal with the most are deglobalization and depopulation. So, first, deglobalization. We do not have a history of trade as a species until really 1945. We had a series of competing imperial systems before that that went after resources and labor and markets and everything, but they kept everything in house. That ultimately generated the World Wars and World War II. At the end of the war, the Americans proposed that they would use their Navy so that everyone could go anywhere at any time and interface with any market, partner with any foreign country, participate in any supply chain, and the United States would open its market if in exchange everyone would line up shoulder to shoulder, not behind us or with us, but in front of us to absorb any ammo that happened to come in from the Soviet Union. We purchased an alliance to fight the Cold War. That's globalization. It was always a security plan for the Americans, not an economic one. And so in the last 7 elections since the Cold War ended, we've elected more and more isolationist and populist presidents, and Biden is the culmination of that. He is more populist and he is more or less of a globalist than even Trump was. This isn't an aberration, this is a trend. Second, depopulation. Normally you have a lot of babies and then fewer children, fewer teenagers, fewer young adults, fewer mature adults, and fewer retirees. Normally, if you stack it all up, you get a pyramid. Well, when the United States allowed global trade, everyone could access all the capital and technologies and resources of the world. So the whole world started to industrialize at a breakneck pace. And when you industrialize, you move to town. And so on the farm, kids are free labor. In town, they're just really, really expensive pets. You do this for 75 years, and we now have a good chunk of the world, the advanced world, that has more people in their 60s than their 50s than their 40s than their 30s than their 10s and so on. And even in the developing world, that process is well past the point of no return because it happened even faster in places like Brazil or India. So we've always known that the 2020s were the decade when we have a demographic bust globally that is irreparable and irrecoverable. This was always coming. It's been coming ever since the Gen X was born, because everywhere in the world, Gen Xers are smaller than the boomers, and in most of the world, the millennials are even smaller, and so on. You add depopulation to deglobalization, and the very future of trade, period, has to change. The concept of global complex supply chains goes away. The idea of a single price for oil goes away. The idea that we can feed 8 billion people goes away. So the end of the world is just the beginning. It's about what's on the backside of this. And we are... Trump sped things up a little bit. Biden sped them up more. COVID really did a number on it. And the Ukraine war is a hard stop. So the old era is already gone. The leading wave was always going to be one of two sectors: energy, because it's so sensitive to disruptions and demand is inelastic. And we're on the leading edge of seeing that. We haven't gotten there quite yet. I'm expecting the majority of Russian oil to just fall off the market within the next couple of months, and then we'll be there. And then the other one is manufacturing, because supply chains are so complicated and complex. And we started seeing that 3 years ago, actually, with COVID and with the rising trade tensions with the Chinese. We now have the Chinese actively panicking about supply chains because they can't not do COVID lockdowns because their vaccine doesn't work. And they're now realize that they've had 2 American presidents back to back that are hyper populist, and everything that Trump said he was going to do, Biden is actually turning into policy. So that decoupling we've started musing about a few years ago is happening at light speeds now, and the companies that were unable or unwilling or just didn't believe it during COVID and refused to diversify or reshore things back to North America, they're so screwed because now we're at that point demographically where the baby boomers are retiring, and that's taking our biggest chunk of skilled labor with them. So we knew that labor costs had to go up when the baby boomers retired. Having to go through a reshoring process of this scale at the same time was always going to be a heavy carry, but it's so much better here than everywhere else. Where does this take us? Well, for the United States, this broadly works out. The United States is a net exporter of oil, and while we will absolutely have to retool some of our refineries and the price balances we're used to for refined products is going to shift, we can get through this because we're going to be doing it in an environment of a saturated market. We don't use a lot of Russian crude. We never did. And refineries have been moving bit by bit in this direction for 15 years because of the shale revolution anyway, to run on what is local. So we'll be okay there. We're the world's largest exporter of foodstuffs. We'll be okay there. And we're in the Western Hemisphere, which is largely, maybe immune's not the right word, but certainly heavily resistant and atypical compared to the Eastern Hemisphere in terms of population structures and trade patterns and resource access. So the United States will have some bumps on the way, but 5 years from now, we're going to be in a better place than we are now with a more stable supply chain system. Getting here, from here to there, it'll be awkward at times. Everybody else is so screwed, though. The primary source of income for East Asia is manufacturing. And a lot of that's going to go away because the East Asian countries don't have sufficient numbers of 20-somethings and 30-somethings and early 40-somethings, the people who consume, to buy what they produce. So when those supply chains relocate, there's nothing left. There's no oil. The agricultural options are very thin. The Chinese import 85% of their oil. 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf, and the United States is no longer there to keep the lines open. They import 85% of the stuff that allows them to feed their population, so they're looking down famine. The story is different based on where you are. But this 70-year period we've been in, where it almost seems like hyper-growth and hyper-technological advancement, because it has been that way, that stops now. Tech development requires scads of young workers who are very bright, the ability to connect them all, and scads of capital to pay for the research, the operationalization, and the implementation. Once the baby boomers retire, the money goes away. And as deglobalization breaks, those connections among workforces goes away. So Silicon Valley will still be there, but it won't have the global network that it's used to. So everything is going to slow down. Tech is something that is added on top that does not function if you don't have energy or food or manufacturing. We understand oil. We know we have to deal with Iraq and Iran and Venezuela and Russia. It's a supply chain that's awkward and painful sometimes, but we understand it. If you want to move to EV, you have to replace the oil supply chain system with 13 more. And we have to deal with 60 countries instead of 5. And if we lose access to any of them, the whole thing collapses. So in a deglobalized world, EVs in the way you're thinking cannot happen. There have only been three technological revolutions in human history that have actually changed the relationship of a society to its economy and a society to its geographic positioning. Sedentary agriculture, deepwater navigation, and the Industrial Revolution. The digital revolution is real. It is changing many things about how we live and how we earn income, but it is dependent upon the Industrial Revolution. It is not a fundamental quantum leap beyond it. So if you break down the energy system of oil and electricity, there's nothing in the digital space that works. And I would argue that we're going to see a great deal of deindustrialization around the world in the next 20 years. We're in the early stages of seeing this in Ukraine, which is kind of unfair considering there's a war going on. But Ukraine gets all of its energy from Russia. And we're going to see 4 to 5 million barrels a day of Russian crude go offline later this year, which means there is not enough for global consumption to continue in its current form. Even if I believed in EVs hugely, the technology isn't far enough along for it to be applied to the poorer locations of the world. So places that depend upon international trade to get the building blocks of modern society, oil, natural gas, copper, iron ore, and so on. We're entering a period of abject shortage as global trade links break down. So there are huge portions of the world, the country I am bar none most concerned about is China, that simply aren't going to have access to the materials that they need to continue in a modern industrialized lifestyle. And if you start to deindustrialize, cities are a death trap. And so you're going to see the cities in these areas to a degree, empty so that people can go back to at least somewhere where they can eat. For the last 75 years, we've had a change in the macro-strategic environment, and that's allowed access from labor or energy or finance or tech from anywhere in the world to go anywhere else. The whole world has been a single system, and the economies of scale have been massive. That's now breaking down. Now, will the changes you're identifying not happen? Not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they can't be broad-based. And there will be countries, I think the US is at the top of that list, that will be able to pursue these things, and that'll allow us to then have the argument about whether they're ready for prime time or not. So baby boomers are leaving the market. That takes a lot of blue collar, that takes a lot of trucking and agriculture away. Gen Xers are a small generation with low labor participation rate. So that means labor inflation's locked in for at least the next decade. The millennials lost 3 to 5 years of expertise, either because they meet the negative stereotypes or because they entered the workforce just in time for the financial crisis and all got fired at the same time. Either way, they're the least skilled generation we've ever had. And that's where you're feeling the pressure in terms of software, because they're just not skilled enough for their age. But the next generation down, the Zoomers, they're antisocial. They were raised by Gen X. They were told that you had to be better than everyone else if you wanted to survive. Their dream job is to live in a closet coding. It's the only job they want. So at least I have some good news for you guys. Your labor concerns in that specific spot are going to go away.